Mother's Day, but also specifically we're going to do a two-part series that we're going to start this Sunday, and then we're going to end it on Father's Day in June, dealing with the idea of leaving a legacy. You know, most of us would like to leave some sort of a legacy, something that we would be remembered by, but most of us don't have the big ideas that we're going to be remembered by the world over. Most of us, as we think about a legacy, about the things that we want people to remember us by, it really pertains to our families, to our children, and for the generations to come. The impact that they had on us. I think about my own family, and I think about the legacy that was left behind me by my grandmothers in particular. My grandma Marie she was a fun lady. She was from Texas, from Henrietta, Texas, and she never let us forget it. She'd actually been out of Texas more years than she lived in Texas, but she still never got Texas completely out of her. And my grandma could be an ornery lady. In fact, she would often remind us that she liked it better in Henrietta because they had a hangman's noose right outside of town. And if you messed up, you knew where you were going. Needless to say, we didn't mess around with Grandma. But one of the things that Grandma always gave for us, even for her orneriness, even for sometimes her kooky views on things. In fact, I often tell people that my grandma makes Rush Limbaugh look like a flaming liberal. She was out there conservative. She was kind of the whole idea of kill them all and let God sort them out kind of person. But she did show us just this unconditional love and caring for my brother and I as just the apple of her eye, and she got great joy anytime that we came over. My grandma on the other side, Grandma Eleanor, was the only Christian in that side of the family, and I didn't really grow up really understanding a lot of the depth of her belief, but when I became a believer, her and I became a lot closer, and I got to see somebody who had a very strong faith, even in the face of a husband, my Grandpa Arnold, who was a wonderful man, but who never made a profession of faith. And I remember talking to her after he died, and I was very young in my Christian faith. I really didn't understand that much, and I said, well, we know that he's in a better place. And she looked at me and she goes, well, he might not be. I was thrown off by it. I said, what do you mean? She goes, I love Arnold with all of his heart, but I shared the gospel with him on many occasions, and he rejected it. So unless in his quiet moments he did receive the gospel, he's not. And she said he was the greatest husband I could ever imagine happening, but it hurts my heart to know that he never made a profession of faith. And I thought, wow, what a strong faith, what a powerful testimony of loving Jesus above all things. It was my Grandma Eleanor who, when my dad was really young, he pulled that thing that kids often do to their mother, and he said to her, he said, Mom, who do you love more, me or us kids or Dad? And she looked down at him and she said, well, Tom, I could tell you, but you're not going to like the answer. That was just my grandma. She was blunt, she was to the point, but she had a very strong faith in who she was. There's a legacy that both grandmothers have left behind. My mother leaves behind a legacy of a woman who not only has a strong faith, but is very giving, very caring. All of those things have impacted me as her children. The reality is that most of us as adults want to leave some sort of a legacy, something that our children will remember, our grandchildren will remember, and on we can go about the way that we lived our life. And we want that legacy to be a good legacy. You know, it's possible to leave a bad legacy, right? Well, we're going to look at here at Mother's Day and also during Father's Day out of Genesis. And we're going to ask ourselves, really, what does it mean to leave a legacy? What does it look like? And what kind of legacy should we want to leave? We'll start, obviously, talking about wives and mothers this Sunday, and then we'll talk about husbands and fathers on Father's Day. So we're going to begin in Genesis chapter 23. Genesis chapter 23. And we're going to look at a mother that we probably don't look at very often when it comes to the idea of being a mother, but I think that we ought to. We're going to look at Abraham's wife, Sarah. And look at what it says. It says, Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. And Sarah died at Kiriath Araba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. So we see here that Sarah is at the end of her life, that she has lived a good life and she's dying. Now, this section doesn't really have to do just with Sarah's death. In fact, the main focus of this section is Sarah's death is kind of a side note onto why Abraham ended up buying the land. In fact, this really shows, this chapter shows Abraham's legal claim to the land that Sarah would be buried in, meaning that Abraham would be the legal owner of a piece of the promised land. In fact, this is the only part of the promised land that Abraham ever bought himself to bury his beloved wife Sarah in it. However, I think that it would be a mistake for us to not spend a little bit of time considering Sarah's life, because Abraham would not approve of that. So what I did as I was putting this together is I wrote up an obituary for Sarah's life. And if you're familiar with Sarah's story, many of these things will jump out of you. So if I was reading Sarah's obituary, here's what I would say. Sarah, wife of Abraham. Sarah was born in Ur of the Chaldeans to Terah, one of his wives. She married Abraham, then known as Abram, and would eventually move with her family to Haran after the death of one of her half-brothers. After her father Terah died, she would go to the land of Canaan with her husband, following the call of God. During their time in Canaan, she would travel extensively throughout the land, even making a trip to Egypt. She'll be remembered as a giving woman, even giving her servant Hagar to her husband to allow him to have a child with her, a decision that she would later regret. Sarah enjoyed a good joke and was even heard at times laughing inside of her tent. Her greatest joy came at the birth of her son Isaac when she was 90 years young. During his childhood, Sarah could be found working hard at home while Abraham and Isaac would go for long walks in the mountains. She went to be with the Lord at the ripe old age of 128 while living in Hebron. Sarah lived an incredible life with many interesting facets. For instance, she was the only woman in the Bible whose age is mentioned, probably for good reason, right? She's listed as one of the Old Testament heroes in Hebrews chapter 11, and she's often mentioned throughout Scripture as an example of a godly woman. She was not known to be a woman whose beauty came from her clothing, her hair, or her jewelry, but from her gentle and quiet spirit. Sarah is survived by her husband Abraham of over 100 years and her son Isaac. You know, all of those are interesting facets and facts about Sarah's life that brings us to the text this morning, where we see Abraham mourning over the loss of his beloved wife. Now, if you read this, you will see that Abraham buys this piece of land, and as I said, it was the only piece of land that he would ever buy in the Promised Land. But that's not her legacy. That's not the legacy that she leaves behind. The legacy that she leaves behind, we're going to see today, is an example of what a godly woman ought to be. And so let's begin by considering the big idea of this message. How can godly women leave a legacy? How can a godly woman leave a legacy? I believe that Sarah gives us a great example of ways that women today can leave a godly example. Now, if you're a man and you're thinking, well, geez, my sermon doesn't come up till June, I can nap today. Two things about that. You nap anyways, so this particular sermon is not a reason that you're napping. And second of all, one of the challenges that I'm going to lay out for women when we get to the Father's Day sermon is the same I'm going to lay out to you today. Part of your responsibility is to help her to do that. And we're actually, as men, under more accountability to God to help our wives in their spiritual growth. Meaning that if your wife is not growing spiritually, that's not her fault, as much as it's your fault in the eyes of God. Now, people might not like that. People might not be comfortable with that idea, but you'll have to take it up with God. Okay? Because God put the husband in that role where he is supposed to be the guide of the spiritual leader, or the spiritual growth in his family. That is the role of the man. It was what he expected from long ago, and he still expects today. He expects that godly leadership. Unfortunately, too many men today in the church have become lazy. They've decided that, well, we'll just let our wives deal with that part of things because we've got manly stuff to focus on. But I tell you, biblically, the most manly thing that you can be focused on is the spiritual growth and the spiritual development of your family. If you fail at that, you fail in many other ways of your life. So you do have a responsibility in this. So as you hear this, and that we're going to specifically give examples of a godly woman, I want you to think about, how can I help to foster godliness in my wife? How can I walk alongside her? How can I help develop? How can I challenge at times where it needs to be challenged? So we're going to talk about how can godly women leave a legacy. And the first thing that we're going to find as we look at the life of Sarah is this: a godly woman leaves a legacy by following God's commands. A godly woman leaves a legacy by following God's commands. If we go back a ways in Sarah's life, we see in chapter 12 of Genesis, it says this: Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. Now, there's so much within that text that we're going to have to miss this morning, but don't worry, we'll pick it up again in the future. But what I really want to focus on here is notice that God speaks to Abraham. He gives him this incredible charge that would change Abram's life forever. It doesn't say that God chose Abram because he was such a great guy, because God liked Abram more than anybody else. God did it for his own reasons. He sent Abram and he said, Go to the land of Canaan. Doesn't tell him what he's going to do there. He doesn't tell him even what he's going to find there. He just says go. Abram has a choice at that point. Will I obey or will I disobey God? But the one that we often forget in there is that Sarai also, who became Sarah later on, also had to deal with this. Abraham, imagine this. Put yourself in her situation for a second. You're there. You're living your life that you've lived for a long time now, 70 years or more. Things are going along well, and then your husband comes home one day and says, Hey, honey, I was out working the fields and God started to talk to me. Okay, what did he say? He said, we're going to leave all of our house, we're going to pack all of our stuff up, and we're going to move. Okay, where are we going to move to? I don't know. Someplace called Canaan. Let's go. How many would go, okay, let's do it? And how many would be like, say what? Are you nuts? I'm not leaving everything I know, my family, my friends, everything I've come to live for and believe in, and now you want me to leave to a place I don't know? How could she do something like that? How would she be able to do that? Well, I think that there's a couple of things that we have to take as we look at Sarah's life. First of all, it's that Sarah had to humble herself before God. See, for Sarah, it wasn't about what she wanted. It wasn't about what her goals and what her hopes were. It wasn't about the trajectory that she thought her life was going on. Because she was married to Abram, they went as a package. You know, that's not a really popular thing to say in this day and time. And I got to tell you, there's a number of things that I'm going to say today that aren't going to be particularly politically correct. They're theologically correct, they fit in with the Bible, but they don't fit in with our modern society today. They don't fit in with this push of total equality. We live in a society where there's this idea that men and women are equal in every possible way. Okay? It's called egalitarianism. There's a fun word for you, right? Egalitarianism. Okay? The idea that men and women are equal in every way. Okay? There are some obvious physical differences, but ultimately they're equal in every way. And there's a push within the world, but even within churches today, towards a more egalitarian sort of setting. Women can do anything that men can do. Women are called in the same way that men are called. Okay? I am not, as your pastor, somebody who is egalitarian. I am what's called a complementarian. Okay? And what complementarianism is it's the idea that men and women are necessarily different, not just in physical ways, but also biblically in the ways that we're called to things. We're called to different things. But those things are complementary to one another. Where April is strong, I am usually weak. And where April is weak, I'm usually strong. We're complementary. We have very specific callings that we have in our life. And my job is to fulfill my calling, and my wife's job is to fulfill her calling, and they're not the same. They're different. And it's not that God loves one of us more than He loves the other one. Because if I was God and I could choose which one to love more, me or her, I know what I would choose. And I wouldn't like the answer. You know, within a society that's so egalitarian today, such a push before that, it is very humbling to say, no, if God is calling my husband to this direction, that's the direction for my life. Remember, our second date, my second date with my wife, I said, you know, I got to be honest with you, and I want to tell you two things. First of all, I'm not dating you because I'm interested in being your friend. I said, if you ever feel like you want to go into the friend zone with me and you don't want to get married someday, then just let me know so we can just be done with it. Because if I'm going to be friends, I'm going to be friends with guys. It's just the way it is. Okay? And I said, the second thing is I've been called to ministry. So because I've been called to ministry, you're going to have to share me with a lot of people and you'll never have any money. You okay with that? It paused her for a second, then she began to pray about what God would have for her. And she still tells me about the time where she was sitting in church and she just felt like God was telling her that she could trust me, that we could have that. And then we began to move into that, the idea of getting married. Okay? So the idea is that just like April had to do, and just like so many others had to do, there's a humbling that goes on. God has a calling on this person's life. And that may mean that the trajectory of my life is going to change significantly. The plans that I had might change significantly. But because they changed, and because God put me with this person, God is involved in it. See, I think that sometimes the problem with egalitarianism is I think that it loses the picture of the sovereignty of God in all things. That God is in control of all things. That God is moving history in the direction that He will have it to go. Sarah had to humble herself before God. She had to say that God's plans were better than her plans, whatever those might have been. Along with that, she had to humble herself before her husband's leadership. Again, this connects right with this. God made the husband the head of the household. Now, husbands often fail to be the head of the household. Husbands often drop the ball. And that's not the fault of the wife. That's on you guys. But if you look at the biblical picture, God has made the husband the head of the household. And I got to tell you, men, again, I'm going to pick on you for a second. If you are being a godly head of the household, most godly women will put themselves under that kind of leadership. Most of the time when I find a headbutting, when it comes to leadership in the family, it's because a man is failing to lead or he's not leading in a godly way. That's when that usually falls apart. Sarah had to humble herself before her husband's leadership. And then finally she had to humble herself enough to show sacrificial love. This was a sacrifice to leave everything that she knew, or at least the people that she knew, in the community that she knew, and go to somewhere that she didn't know what she was walking into. That's sacrifice. You know, when I do counseling, premarital counseling for couples, one of the things that I ask them is I say, why do you want to get married? And almost all the young people say the same thing. Because we love each other. And then I try to mess with them a little bit and I say, well, that's no reason to get married. What? That's what our world says. You love each other, you get married. It's not the way it works out. In the Christian church, we talk about being married. Don't we want to love each other? Well, here's the problem. Love, as important as it is, and as strong as it is, ultimately is an emotion. Sometimes we're feeling all warm and squishy about somebody, but anybody who's been married more than 6 months knows there's other times we don't feel that way. There's other times where we're like, I am devoted to this person, but I don't want to look at this person right this second. I'm convinced that's why, guys, we need a man shop or a garage or something. Because sometimes we just need to go there to cool off. And more often, we need to go there so she can cool off. Right? Other people say, well, the key to a good marriage is communication. You got to communicate. And I'm not going to say, just like I say that love is important in a relationship, communication is important in a relationship, but it's not the key to a good relationship. It's important, but it's not the key. Okay? Because there's a lot of things that we communicate in a relationship that we shouldn't have communicated. Been there, done that? Anybody else have foot and mouth disease?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that are said in a relationship that would probably be better off if you'd allow yourself to think about it first and ask yourself, do I really need to say this? Do I really need to say that? Both the man and the woman, okay? You don't ever have to tell your spouse, I told you so, if you told them so. Just let that lie. If you need to go off on your own and say, I told her, do it in your man shop, okay? But I guarantee you, I've never seen a situation where a guy said, honey, I told you not to do that. And she said, you know, you're right. You are so brilliant. I am so lucky that God gave me you. If I would only be intelligent enough to listen to you all the time, wouldn't my life be better? That's never happened. And it never will. So if love and communication are not the keys to a good relationship, what is? I already said it, sacrifice. Sacrifice. Sacrifice is what gets you through those times where you're not your best. Sacrifices gets you through that time when he is not his best. When she is not her best. Sacrifice recognizes that the true love displayed the best way it can be is sacrificial. Now understand, unlike some preachers who I have major issues with, if you've been watching the news at all, you've seen that one preacher in particular said something really dumb here this last couple of weeks. I don't believe there's any place for submissiveness when it comes to abuse in a relationship. If there's abuse in a relationship, that needs to get help immediately. But when I'm talking about submissiveness, it's that recognition that God has put this person in this leadership position. And I'm going to submit to what God is leading them to do. Submit what God is calling them to do. Well, what is the outcome that Sarah experienced? The outcome is that God blesses her and her family when she follows his commands. God blesses her and her family when she follows it. You know, I've never met anybody who said, you know, I'm not really interested in getting the blessings of God. Nah. I'd rather have God's curses. No, all of us want the blessing of God, right?
Yes.
We want to know how to have the blessings of God. Follow God's commands. Does that mean everything is going to go great for you? Does that mean that all of your circumstances are going to be great? No, circumstances are not necessarily the blessing of God. That's where a lot of TV preachers miss it. They think if you have enough faith, God will give you whatever you want. If you have enough faith, he'll make your wallet heavy. And then they'll try to make it light again. Isn't that the way it works? That's nonsense. God sometimes blesses us in our circumstances, yes. But that's not necessarily the blessing of God. In fact, when we see the blessing of God in Scripture, over and over again, that had to do with a relationship. It was a relational blessing. Sometimes that came with material, but the material blessing is a side thing. So God blesses her and her family when she follows his commands. Next, godly women leave legacies by loving her husband through the ups and downs of life. You know, I've been on this earth for 43 years, about 43 years now. And one of the things I've learned is that there's some times that you're up and there's some times that you're down, right? Some of you have been around slightly longer than me, right? Slightly. Sometimes there's ups, sometimes there's downs. Sometimes in a relationship there's ups and downs. Think about this. Chapter 12, verse 10 of Genesis, it says, "Now there was a famine in the land." Is that a time of down? You better believe it. Okay? We don't really understand that in our day and time because, you know, a famine comes and usually we still have food in the grocery store, right? They had a famine, guess what? No grocery store. Difficult time. So there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, "I know that you are a woman of beautiful appearance." What a great way to start it, right? Who doesn't want to hear that? "And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with you because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake." Now, think about this for a second. They're going to Egypt. Abraham has this thought: my wife is beautiful. My wife is good looking. When I go to Egypt, they're going to want her. And they're going to kill me to get her. So, to protect myself, I want you, sweetheart, to tell them, no, that's my brother, it's not my husband. So then they can do whatever they want with you and I'll be safe. Doesn't that work out great? What a great plan for me, right? You know, this is an example of Abraham messing up. Okay? And if it's not enough that he messed up this once, he's going to do it again later on with Abimelech. He does it twice in there. Now let's be honest. How many wives are sitting there thinking, you know what? It'd be okay if my husband did this with me. It'd be okay if we, went to the bad side of town. We're driving over through, I don't know, let's just say Hilliard. Thinking, honey, it's tough. It's tough over here. This is the rough side of the tracks for Spokane. If anybody asks you if you're my wife, just take your ring off and say, "No, I'm available." And then you'll save me. Any of the women here going, "Yeah, sign me up for that. Sounds like a good thing in my mind." And what if you did it again? The reality is that this is laid out as a time where Abraham made a huge mistake. made a huge mistake. Women, I might be telling you something new, but I'm probably not. Your husband's going to mess up sometimes. I don't need to hear a list. Just about every woman here looked at their husband when I said that. We're going to mess up sometimes. Why? Because we're human and we're male. Okay? We're going to mess up sometimes. It's what everybody does. How did she get through that, though? How did she deal with those mess-ups? Okay? Drinks. No, it doesn't say anything about her drinking. Okay? The first thing that she does, though, is she trusts that God is faithful. Okay? She trusts that God is faithful. I firmly believe that she was able to get through this because she knew that God was faithful. She knew that her God was faithful. You know, down times in life can make us question God's faithfulness. All of us have had those times where maybe our health hasn't been great. Maybe we're dealing with depression. Maybe we're dealing with problems. Maybe it seems like people are against us. Maybe the circumstances are bad. Maybe we lost a job. And on and on and on we can go. We go to those times in our life where things are very, very difficult. And unfortunately, sometimes we question whether God is faithful in those times. Is God really faithful or is he not? You know, Sarah understood something without saying it here. She understood something that we have to understand too. God had a bigger plan for her life. God had a greater, grander vision plan for her life. He had called her to something greater than herself. He had called her to something greater than her circumstances. You know, Sarah wouldn't know anything about this because she lived so long ago in her time, but her story still can impact us today. It can still impact our faith today. That's something amazing to think about. You know, Sarah could have never had it in her mind that the book called Hebrews would ever be written, and that she would end up being written as one of those faith heroes. And that not only her people, but Christians all the way here in Otis Orchards, Washington, would be able to be inspired and moved towards her kind of faithfulness. She had no idea. And even when she died, she had no idea. She was called to something greater, so she could trust that God was faithful. She also could realize that she too was flawed. You know, even though she is seen as a faith hero, the reality is that sometimes her faith faltered too. Sometimes her faith wasn't all it needed to be. You know, we don't excuse our failures and flaws. We don't excuse the failures and flaws of other people easily all the time. But we do need to step back every once in a while and realize, you know what? I'm flawed too. I'm flawed too. I always tell young couples when they're about to get married, something that I heard in my marriage counseling when I was going through marriage counseling before our wedding. Our pastor sat us down and he said, what do you want to change about this other person? We thought about it for a second and we really didn't answer anything and couldn't come up with anything. And he said, good, don't change that. He said, because if you set out to try to change that person, they won't. And you're just going to have a life of frustration. He said, oh, don't get me wrong, they will change over time naturally in various different ways. Things that I was never into before or interested in, I'm a lot more interested in now. When I first met April, I had no interest in the theater whatsoever. Not talking about the movie theater, I've always had interested in that. There was a time in my life when I was a teenager where we saw every Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, even the really bad ones, which is most of them, when they first came out, like the day of. But I'm talking about the theater where they actually have real actors on the stage acting out things. I had no interest in that whatsoever. And the idea that I would ever be caught dead in a musical, yeah, right. Well, my wife wanted to go to a musical. I was like, oh man, all right. Well, guess what? And maybe this is confessional time, but I love musicals now. I had a great joy out of them. We change over time, but not because somebody forces you to, but because it just happens as you love one another. But you know, if we realize that we're flawed ourselves, and we don't set out to try to fix everybody else's flaws, but we fix the only flaws that we can fix, those are our own, we'll find that God will work on those other people also. So what was the outcome? The outcome is that her husband would be devoted to her, and she would be able to experience miraculous blessings from God. There's no question that Abraham was devoted to his wife. We see him even mourning here at the end of her life. He was devoted to her, and she would get to experience some incredible blessings. Third, and finally, a godly woman leaves a legacy by providing for the needs of her family. By providing for the needs of her family. Think about it in Genesis chapter 21. Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 through 3. It says, the Lord visited Sarah, and he said, as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah what he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Sarah got to experience the blessing that she had been looking for. She became a mother at a very, very old age. How did she provide for her family? How would she do that? Okay. Now, how many women would love it for God to come up and say, you're going to have a child when you're 90? Some of you are like, I'm a few years from that, and I don't want to even think about that. How in the world was she going to provide for this family? Well, one of the ways that she did that is she supported her husband throughout her life. She was his great, outside of God, she was his great support structure. We never once see Sarah going against Abraham in anything. We don't see her saying, oh, I don't want to be part of that. Oh, I don't agree with that. Oh, I'm not going that way. I'm sure as a husband and wife, they had their different disagreements about things. They didn't see everything exactly the same. But she humbled herself under his leadership, and she doesn't fight with him about things. A survey of 238 counseling centers, it was discovered that there were 5 top, what they call basic needs that every man had in common. And I'll just list the 5. Sexual fulfillment, recreational companionship, an attractive spouse, which doesn't say much about guys, domestic support, and admiration. I want to talk about the last 2 there. Okay? Men want to feel as if someone is there to support them and someone who admires them for who they are. Someone who will support them and admire them for who they are. Why? Well, one of the reasons for that is men are really good at tearing down other men. The world around us, in a lot of ways, are good at tearing down men. You ever been with a group of men who aren't Christian men? Is there a lot of encouraging words going around in those circles a lot of times? No. I spend once a week with a group of men who are quite an interesting group, love them to death, but boy, the way they talk to each other, I'm like, I'm glad I'm not very sensitive about that kind of stuff, because I'd be feeling bad about myself all the time. Men are good at tearing one another down. Sometimes it's the way that men test how much of a man you're going to be. It's by poking fun at each other, pointing out things about one another. And then we have a world that so often tears men down. You watch TV shows these days, who's the buffoon? Always dad, right? Dad's always the goof. He's always the one that's like, oh, dumb old dad. Good thing he has kids to show him the way. The world is very good at tearing men down. I got to tell you, if men are not supported and respected at home, they will look for it somewhere else. I've been doing this for about 20 years now, being a pastor, pastoral leadership. And I found that when men go the direction that they ought not to, often you can look back and see that they weren't getting the respect and the support that they needed at home. And they went and found it somewhere else. Men need that. They need to feel that support. They need to feel that respect. They need to feel like it's important. Like they're important. She also provided for their marital needs. Okay? She provided for the marital needs. Now I'm not going to go into too much detail with this, but you all are adults. Okay? They had a child when she was 90. A time where it would be very easy to say, no. No, not going down that road. You know, we don't like to talk about this so much, but strong and happy marriages are strong and happy in the bedroom too. She also protected her son from danger. In Genesis chapter 21, verses 18 through 14, we see that Sarah actually pushes Hagar and Ishmael away. Ishmael is the son that Abraham had with Hagar after Hagar was given to her, or given to Abraham. She pushes him away. And as we see that, we might say, well, that doesn't sound very loving and kind of Sarah. The way that she approaches this seems not very loving and kind. However, she had a desire to protect Isaac's rightful place as the child of promise. If Ishmael was there, he would have had a rightful legal claim to it. But because he was sent away, he no longer had a rightful legal claim to it. Yes, Sarah made a mistake in setting that in motion in the first place, but she protects her child. One of the things that I've learned about good mothers is that good mothers often earn that term mama bear, right? You've heard that say, right? The mama bear comes off the fact that if you get in between a mama bear and her cubs, that's not going to go well for you, right? That's the worst case scenario. Well, try to get in between a mom and her child. And it's pretty much the same thing, right? Sweet, loving, kind person can become a bear if it's coming in between them and their child. And that's natural. It's what's expected. It's what good mothers will do. Why? Because they're going to protect their children from danger however they can. What was the outcome for her? When the family is provided for, she found fulfillment. When the family was provided for, she found her fulfillment there. We live in a world that is so self-centered, so self-involved, that people think that the way that we find fulfillment is by getting stuff. Getting what we want, our circumstances going right, everything being happy for us. Happiness and fulfillment is when we go to Oprah Winfrey and she gives us a car. That's happiness, right? Wrong. That's wrong. True happiness, true fulfillment is when you see a mother seeing that her family is provided for. I've had the opportunity to go to many, because I was a youth pastor for 11 years, and I've gone to many high school graduations. And high school graduations can be extremely painful. Why? Because you hear the same speech every year. The friendships that we made here will last a lifetime. And anybody who's adults are going, yeah, right. I don't remember anybody from high school. The only reason I know what's going on with any of the people from high school is Facebook. And I don't really even get that involved in all of that. The things we learn here, we'll cherish with us. Really? You're going to get to college and they're going to spend the first year undoing everything that you learned in high school. It's the way it is. But So, one of the things I do love about high school graduations is to be able to look at parents, but especially the mothers, and the pride that they have in their face knowing that their child accomplished this. No parent sees their kid get through the high school years and doesn't have challenges, doesn't have great challenges that come up. You get to see that pride in their face, that joy. Why? Because they recognize that their child is fulfilling a goal that the parents had for them. I think about my mom. I get to brag on my mom for a second because she's not here to stop me. My mom gets her fulfillment for what's going on in my life and my brother's life. One of my mom's greatest joys in life is she loves to be here, see her son preach. In fact, one of the reasons I record the sermons is to outreach, but also because my mom wants to watch the sermons. What a great opportunity for her to be able to do that. My mom has shown me throughout her life what sacrificial love looks like. What it feels like to have somebody that finds their fulfillment not in what they can achieve, not what they can get, not the title that they get, not what they can accomplish. My mom accomplished a lot. My mom was the first Seattle police officer, the first woman to pass through the basic training for police and to get hired on the police force as a 40-year-old woman. Okay, that's not an easy thing, to be a 40-year-old woman and get onto the police force. My mom did that. My mom has accomplished a lot of pretty amazing things in her life, but if you asked her what the greatest joy, she would point out after her relationship with Jesus, she would point out what her children have done, who her children are, what they've become. So women of God, do you want to leave a legacy? Follow God's commands. Love your husband through and in spite of the up and downs of life, and provide for the needs of your family. You do that, and you will leave a legacy that will be remembered long after this life is over. Let us pray.